Oh. Right. Okay, so I guess we can start with the first presentation. Will be there's a little change in the names. You find some programs around. If you can maybe distribute them. There is a little change. I will be presenting with Sarah. Sarah is a PhD student at York University who has been one of our key graduate assistants in the project. And another person who has been key is Angelica Galante, who's now a colleague in Concordia University, who's at distance and who will help us with the questions, although she's not present. So, what's happening here? Right. Okay. So I will give you a little bit of the project background and discuss, as I said, the theoretical and pedagogical framework and methodology that we used during the program. And we will then talk in this first presentation briefly about the piloting that we had in the Ojibwe Anishinaabemowin context with one example of the scenario and task, and finally we will present some of the data and final considerations related to only this specific context. And then we will move to the other contexts and the other languages in the second presentation. As Dr. Bretter already said, that this is a partnership development grant, which is spanned 4 years, was funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and we are at the end of our fourth year. The University of Toronto was the leading institution and I was the principal investigator, but as you see, we have been a consortium of many institutions, universities and schools and communities for a total of over 20 researchers. So why did we want to do this project, basically? Well, if you look at two realities, we started with the idea of focusing more on North America and having also a view of Europe, although the problems, the issues are a bit different because the indigenous part is not necessarily, is not there in the same, at least not in the same way, but we still have a great linguistic diversity in Europe. But we were focusing more our attention on the North American context. If you look at these two countries, if you look at Canada, we have over 7 million Canadians that speak a non-official language, and we have in the census 70 Aboriginal languages and over 100 heritage languages. And we have, on the other side, a country that seems more monolingual than Canada, because in Canada we have the chance of being a bilingual country. Another country that seems more monolingual than us, in reality, has approximately the same kind of configuration, with over 60 million Americans that speak another language other than English, and even more native languages, 134, and 382 languages in total. So, so basically, Canada and the US are very diverse, but at the same time, they are both considered hotspots, which means that there is a rapid vanishing of Aboriginal languages, as research has showed. And there is a risk for 80% of Canada's Aboriginal language to be on their way to extinction. So when we had to choose what language we wanted to focus on, we chose, and we contacted the colleague and friends in Ojibwe Anishinaabemowin. Then Sarah will explain why we used two words. And because it was one of, let's say, the strong languages, and also for context reasons. However, we know that around the country, other projects are also done for other languages, and we had the chance then to have other colleagues in other indigenous languages that were interested in and started to work with our material. This is a big problem in both countries, because both countries have absorbed and have a lot of different languages, and yet there is this big problem of disappearing indigenous languages and of heritage languages that are not necessarily moving across the generation, that are lost in a couple of generations. So the disconnect between research results and educational policies and educational practices was something that drove us towards this, this project. And if we look at what research says, we see that there is a lack of recognition of those non-dominant languages in school, in mainstream education, that very often, even when there is an attention to trying and incorporate different cultures, is done in a folkloric way, in a kind of essentializing way. That schools have this wealth of plurilingual speakers, and yet they don't seem to be prepared to take advantage of this linguistic diversity, and they don't seem to be able to counter the loss of the decline of home languages, and thus with the risk of perpetuating inequities in education. And still, we see that there is this idea that L1 maintenance is not necessarily seen as an asset, but is sometimes seen as an obstacle. The fact that there are students whose mother tongue is not the language of schooling is still seen as an obstacle. And we must say that the tools are not there yet. There are not many tools that promote plurilingualism and linguistic diversity. So we thought, well, why don't we try and embark in a project where we try and create together tools that can help teachers face this situation and can help them maybe start changing this mentality. Of course, 4 years is not a big time, but what some grains can be planted. So the first thing that we did in our project was to try to read a lot and to try and come up with a kind of theoretical view and model. And we saw that what helped us mostly was to try and see what in the Western tradition was there that could help us make the link with the indigenous worldview. We started from the idea that in the Western tradition, we lacked aspects that are in the indigenous epistemologies, mainly a holistic view of the human being, a holistic view of education, and connection with the community, the context, and vice versa. We thought that our colleagues in indigenous languages didn't have a longer tradition of teaching their language as a foreign or second language, and they didn't necessarily share the expertise that has been done through errors and trial and errors, we must say, over the decades in language education in the Western. And this was our main initial idea. But even in the Western, there are different traditions and different worldviews that have developed through time. So we kind of came up, after reading and analyzing many theories, to have a complexity-informed view, complexity-informed theories of learning that we kind of put together, saying that all those theories that in some way help us see things as complex and adaptive context and way of doing can help us to make this transition. So you see our model here, and we started with the socio-constructivist approach. Oh, sorry, the socio-constructivist approach that gave us. It's very difficult to follow on to. Sorry. So let me go a moment. We started with a socio-constructivist approach. We considered the humanistic approach that is a paradigm that emerged in the 60s. So the sociocultural theory, the socio-constructivist was developed, or not developed, but started to be known in the late 70s, in which social interaction is fundamental to cognitive development, and all cognitive functions originate in and are explained as products of social interaction, and the learning is a process by which learners are integrated into a knowledge community. Then we looked at the humanistic view, which is a paradigm that emerged a bit early in the 60s, that focus on freedom, human freedom, dignity, potential of human being. We looked at place community-based approach that focus on the fact that all learning is situated and is linked to the community. We moved to the action-oriented approach, of which you will learn much more through the second presentation, which is similar, somehow linked to the task-based language teaching that is more known in North America, but has been developed further through the work of the Council of Europe. We considered the plurilingual approach, which has been developed through the work of the Council of Europe. And finally, one important model for us was the multiple cultures model. I will say a bit more on these last two. So the social interaction, as I said, socio-constructivism, social interaction is fundamental to cognitive development because all functions originate in and are explained as products of social interaction. The humanistic approach is a holistic approach that focus on human freedom, dignity, and potential. And the idea is that people act with intentionalities and values, and promotes personal self-direction and independence, and the ability to take responsibility in what one learns, and to be creative, to be curious. As you will see when we present our material, this is really key in what we developed. The place community based approach is the idea that learning is rooted in what is local. And so history, culture, environment, economy, literature of a particular place. And the community provides the context, but provides also somehow the reason for learning. And this is something also that you will see in our tasks. The action-oriented approach is the idea that we learn through scenarios, and these scenarios are real life oriented. So if we learn a language just for the sake of learning a language, as if it was an object disconnected from reality, we don't see very much the point of learning that language. But as soon as we enter in the idea of engaging in authentic, practical, and functional use of language for meaningful purposes, then we see why we needed to learn. And this was somehow confirmed by our data, and we're very happy of that. Don't think that the word practical means just using the language for doing practical thing. The idea that it is situated in real life. In real life, we also read literature, we also read poets. So it's not just practical in the sense of functional. And the action-oriented approach, in reality, one of the tasks that you will see is storytelling for the 21st century, which is precisely on literature, on one type of literary genre. Then as I said, the plurilingual approach was one of our fundamental lenses, that languages are not disconnected. At the level of the individual, they are always there. Whatever you do to keep them separate, they are not in your brain. And so the idea is that they form a repertoire, a composite competence that allows the students to develop more effective learning strategies using all their linguistic and cultural potential, all their resources. The problem is allowing them to use them and to see that this is a value and this is not an obstacle, because very often we make a huge effort to keep those languages pure and separate and not to contaminate one with each other, because we are in what Gogolin calls a monolingual disposition. Even when we study plenty of language, even when we study 2 or more languages, we tend to go with this idea. Well, plurilingualism is exactly the contrary, and it gives, it says that you don't start from zero. Every time you learn a language, you have at least another language, and probably in that language you have dialects and you have different sociolects also in that language. And so the mother tongue or tongues, because we have more and more increasingly students that have more than one language, are always present. And the errors are in reality opportunities for transfer. They are not bad things that need to be suffocated, but they are opportunities for transfer. So learning is a reflective process. You see what you do, you see what you have learned, you kind of put that in connection with the other languages that you have learned before, or that you are learning, or that you are somehow exposed to, and you build on that, you reflect. So as we said at the beginning, remember our frame with the different theories. Learning is a social process and it's a cognitive at the same time. And plurilingualism gives space for both, for this cognitive growth, because you start to see links where you first saw contamination, let's say, and social, because you are exposed and you are in contact with different languages and cultures, and you build on these aspects. So if you build on that, you probably open doors also to pluriculturalism, which is totally linked to plurilingualism, because every language is the tool for expressing different cultures. Within the same language, we have a lot of different cultures. So the moment you see languages and cultures interconnected, you also see, you start not seeing all those barriers. You start not seeing English as just one culture, or German or Italian, but many cultures conveyed by those languages, and all intertwined, as I show in this picture. And to go back to, you see, the last one that we had talked about was the multiple cultures model. You don't see it here because I moved, but multiple cultures model is the idea that learning materials and activities are centered on epistemological pluralism, and to help raise the students' awareness of the cultural diversity, and to co-construct in their interaction with their peers a learning space where multiple cultures' perspectives are made visible and debatable. Look at those cultures. See, there are something that we automatically consider cultures, but there are other, like dominant cultures or indigenous and ethnic minority cultures, but there are also other cultures that are more personal, like gender, religion, class, workplace culture, and training, etc. So this model was particularly interesting for us because it showed that you can use the word cultures at very different levels and to indicate things that are more local or more global. And again, what What is not showing? Because, oh, that's good. I think there is something with the adapter. She said she could change. Well, how did we get then to, that was the Western, like there was a lot of work to understand that, but how did we get to try and bridge over the indigenous culture? Well, we started to be inspired by something that is far away from us, because this comes from Australia, and it's a model that a colleague did where he showed 8 Aboriginal ways of learning. And when we saw this model, we said, there are so many things here that are similar in aspect, like the learning is non-linear, that there is it's embedded in the land, in the community, that it can be done through deconstruct and reconstruct to symbols, images, that can be verbal, non-verbal. So we were really fascinated by this model, and we presented this model to our colleague. We said, yes, it's very interesting, but if we're working here in North America, we need to make a connection to something that is embedded apropos in the land. And so what they suggested was that we take one of the key one of the key symbols of the indigenous culture, which is the medicine wheel, to help us develop a pedagogical framework that could speak to these different aspects. And there we did a lot of work to try and boil down what we had understood with the help of our colleague into something that could be compatible with the indigenous way of knowing. And the medicine wheel is, as you know, says that learning is holistic, and learning happens through spirit, emotion, body, and mind. And I still have this one. Okay, we would like to stress here, I would like to do it right on, that this image is not intended to be representative of all indigenous worldview. There are some variations in the interpretation and beliefs and the organization of the wheel. However, it was for us key to understand that there are all these dimensions, and all these dimensions need to be taken into consideration at all times. So the mind quadrant is often the sole focus of mainstream education and pedagogies, whereas it's one of the 4. The mind stresses the importance of meta-linguistic, metacognitive knowledge, and the importance of building autonomy in the language learning process. This is how we kind of interpret it to try and put together the 2 views. What is often neglected, as I said, in mainstream approaches, is that there is also the spirit, emotions, and body of the learners. So the spirit quadrant emphasizes the interconnectedness of all things, the importance of building relationships and learning both with and for the community. The emotional quadrant tells us of the importance of stories, images, visuals, even laughter in the language learning process. And the body quadrant reminds us that learning is embodied and is cyclical, and it occurs in multiple ways and can take also direct and indirect forms. And in this way, we developed this, which is basically our basic model of LINCDIRE, where you see the 4 aspects, how we declined the 4 dimensions: mind, self-reflection on my language learning; plurilingual awareness, my language strategies; spirit, self-reflection on my roots, my inter and cross-cultural encounters; emotion, myself as a plurilingual being; and my learning experience in the broader sense. And we developed a logo that also by itself, with this kind of open chain, tries to symbolize the link between the 2 aspects. And in the middle, there is my chosen work. And again, it doesn't work. Right. And from that, we developed, you see, one part in our online tool that is inspired by the medicine wheel, and in the center you have a quill box where the students would put their best work. It's a kind of my treasure chest, my quill box with the best work. And in the electronic portfolio, all these aspects are clickable, and the students are helped to reflect of the development of their learning process. And we got to our model that is based on 4 pillars, and I let Sarah continue.
Okay, thanks. So the theoretical framework that Enrica outlined really helped inform the design of LINCDIRE's unique pedagogical model. And this pedagogical model brings together what our project team refers to as the 4 pillars of the project. And those are plurilingualism, the action-oriented approach, indigenous epistemologies, and technology-enhanced language learning. And it's really these 4 pillars that culminate in an approach to language learning that first and foremost structures student work around a series of real-life and community-based action-oriented tasks, as opposed to a series of discrete grammar points or themes. In this way, we see language use in the classroom becoming more applicable to the learner and more relevant to their future contexts of language use in the real or imagined communities in which they're embedded. Within each task, each step or subtask speaks to one or more of the quadrants of the medicine wheel, so that learning extends just beyond the metalinguistic and metacognitive knowledge to encompass and develop the learner's spirit, emotions, and bodies as well. Each of the action-oriented tasks which we designed also challenge monolingual approaches to language education by positioning learners' existing linguistic resources as functional to the task achievement. And this encourages students to activate and to build on the other languages in their plurilingual repertoire at the same time that they're developing skills in the target language of the classroom. Each task that we've designed in this model also has been designed to be collaborative, which allows students to not only interact with and rely on and learn from their own experiences, but those from their plurilingual and pluricultural peers as well. Finally, in order to encourage student autonomy and student pride in their unique trajectories, each task in this model involves what's a post-task reflection that's organized around the medicine wheel quadrants. And so this reflection is designed to move beyond the self-assessment that's typical of language classrooms and very limited usually to linguistic development. That's just the next one there. Okay. Perfect. In designing this model and the resulting online tool that you'll hear about later today, we followed a design-based research methodology that was comprised of several iterative stages of designing, piloting, refining, applying, and evaluating the tool's potential in various contexts. This design process began in 2015 when the LINCDIRE project was formed, and at this early stage, the research team shared readings and materials from their respective areas of expertise and then collaboratively worked to locate the synergies between them. Through this collaboration, we then developed the pedagogical framework and a master template for task design, and then from that designed our online portfolio. And since then, all of these have been revised several times as we've responded to teacher, student, and task developer feedback. In 2016, we invited teachers who were already somewhat familiar with the action-oriented approach to pilot paper-based versions of the tasks. And then in 2017 and 18, a bigger implementation involving the online version of the tool was organized with teachers of several languages across Canada, the United States, and Europe. During this time, we were able to gather data from both students and teachers to explore the efficacy of this approach in creating change to language education. And so for this data collection, which you'll hear more about later today, we used a combination of methods, including interviews, focus groups, online discussions, and classroom observations, and online surveys pre and post task. Finally, as the LINCDIRE project kind of wraps up now this spring, we've been busy finalizing our data analysis and preparing for the public launch of LITE later this year. Kimberly and Jason, in the second presentation, will discuss this data collection in more detail. So here, Enrica and I will limit our discussion to the findings from two Nishnaabemwin language learning contexts. The first is from the Anishinaabemowin Revival Program, which focuses on teaching Nishnaabemwin as a second language to students from kindergarten to grade 3 at Lakeview Elementary School on Chiging First Nation. The second data set is from a post-secondary Nishnaabemwin course that's offered through the University of Sudbury. And over the course of 2018, our task development team, which will be involved in the panel discussion later today, worked closely with teachers and curriculum developers at these schools to create scenarios for learning that fit with the learner's contexts, but that also met the existing curriculum objectives that the teachers were working with. To help us contextualize some of the challenges and some of the successes that you'll hear about in the findings section, we'd just like to provide you with a little bit of additional information on the Nishnaabemwin revitalization context. And I'd like to acknowledge that this portion of the presentation was prepared by Marianne Corbier, our colleague at the University of Sudbury, who could not be here today, but who's asked me to read her notes on her behalf. Ojibwe is one of several languages in the Algonquian language family, and its speakers generally use the term Nishnabek to refer to themselves. And when remarking on whether or not someone speaks the language of this people, they use the verb Nishnaabemu. As the language is being taught formally in schools now, which is a practice that began in the 1970s, they derived the term Nishnaabemwin from the verb in order to discuss it in its English-speaking contexts. The territory of the Anishinaabe people prior to the arrival of the Europeans extended around the Great Lakes and into the prairies, and they now reside on First Nation or reservations that are scattered throughout that area. According to the Union of Ontario Indians, which is an organization that represents Anishinaabe First Nations, there are 40 such communities in Ontario, and their combined total population is 60,000. Most of these communities have a very small population, and in many cases, this number is under 1,000. Statistics Canada data indicate that in 2016, roughly 20,500 people have Ojibwe as their mother tongue, and 21,800 speak it in the home. The same data also suggests that the number of speakers of Indigenous languages overall grew slightly by about 3% between 2006 and 2016. In the first few decades after Nishnaabemwin began being taught in schools, teachers got their training at the Native Language Instructors Program located at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay. Another program of the same type was added fairly recently in North Bay, Ontario. And in those first few decades, there was a relatively large number of mother tongue speakers, so the enrollment in those training programs consisted almost entirely of such speakers. But today that population is aging. As well, more of the younger population is obtaining university degrees and quite a few Bachelor of Education degrees. Any such graduates who took Nishnaabemwin during their degree studies were only able to take one course on this language. With more school boards now being asked to offer Nishnaabemwin, it's often such teachers who took just one or two courses who are asked to teach the language to others. And in the past 10 or 15 years, some Bachelor of Education holders in that situation have thus enrolled in the Native Language Instructors Program at Lakehead and Nipissing. Clearly, Nishnaabemwin is now very imperiled. Observations from within a community member perspective suggest that the growth which Statistics Canada indicates may not actually be happening in the case of Nishnaabemwin. It's rarely heard among the youth in public contexts today, as English seems to be the dominant language in most communities and homes. That kind of community-based evidence strongly suggests that the use of Nishnaabemwin has greatly declined since the 1970s, and that decline is not being reversed despite the language having been taught in schools and in a number of post-secondary institutions for about 4 decades now. It's apparent from those observations that very little intergenerational transmission of Nishnaabemwin is occurring. students coming out of grade 12 and university still have quite limited proficiency in the language. Clearly, Anishinaabemowin programming in schools is just not having the impact that's needed to revitalize the language. And Marianne writes that it's really this situation which made the teaching method that was piloted by LINCDIRE of great interest to instructors such as herself. Wikwemong and Chiging are two of the largest Anishinaabe First Nations in Ontario, and they're both located on Manitoulin Island. Chiging First Nation has a population of roughly 2,500, and the Lakeview School, where the LINCDIRE tasks were piloted, goes up to grade 8. In Ontario, schools that have a significant number of Indigenous students teach the pertinent Indigenous language. So for this reason, Nishnaabemwin is taught at quite a few schools throughout Ontario. Sudbury, being in the area that was traditionally Anishinaabe territory, offers many courses in Nishnaabemwin, one at the University of Sudbury, and that's our second piloting site. So the University of Sudbury is federated with Laurentian University and has included courses on Nishnaabemwin as part of its Indigenous Studies program since the program was established around 1980. So it was really in this context that we worked with both Marianne and the curriculum team at Lakeview's Nishnaabemwin Revival Program to develop a series of action-oriented tasks, which I said could be relevant to the students' needs and which could fit already with the teacher's existing curriculum goals. And so here is just one example of this collaborative effort. This scenario was called the Pow Wow. It was designed for post-secondary adults at the A1, A2 CFR level. And in this Pow Wow scenario, students are first presented with the following scenario overview, to which they remain oriented for the entirety of the task. So in this task, students see a poster for an upcoming Pow Wow that they'd like to attend, and the friend who they invite to attend has never been to a Pow Wow before. In this task, students exchange text messages to plan their Pow Wow outing, and one friend spends some time at the Pow Wow explaining the different vendor booths and dances that they see and walking around commenting on the different objects. In achieving this task, it's clear that students must develop certain language to do so, right? They need to be able to talk about powwows, talk about the vendor booths. They need to be able to give directions to their friend and make arrangements. They need to be able to understand texting conventions and develop an understanding as well of culturally appropriate behavior at powwows. And so the goal for each of the tasks that we've created always extends beyond just linguistic. Designing these tasks involved working very closely with the CFR descriptors for both communicative activities and communicative competences. And so through a backwards design, we thought about the linguistic and other goals of the scenario. And then what we did was selected relevant descriptors from these two related sets that we refer to as the what of the task and the how of the task. The first set of descriptors related to what communicative activities would the task be engaging learners in. And so each of these communicative activities that we've outlined here, the ability to ask and answer simple questions or initiate and respond to simple statements, the ability to take part in a simple conversation, give a short kind of practice presentation, or write a simple text message to a friend, in turn involves the activation and the development of various competences and skills, the how. So the second part of designing tasks involved matching each of those communicative activities to the appropriate descriptors for linguistic competence, plurilingual and pluricultural competence, pragmatic and sociocultural competence, as well as the ability of mediation and language learning strategies that students would need to develop their skills and to achieve that culminating task. When designing learning scenarios, we also always thought about the ways that each of the steps within the task could relate to that development of the holistic self. So in this particular powwow scenario, we engaged the mind quadrant through designing activities that focused on raising awareness of cross-linguistic and cross-cultural conventions for times and dates. To tend to the kinesthetic self of the learner, we designed the task so that learning could occur in cyclical ways and would happen in direct and indirect ways, both inside and outside the classroom, so going out into the community. To consider students' emotional self, we encourage the sharing of stories throughout their preparation for this task, previous Pow Wow experience, and the creation of student-created images and materials to help them. And finally, through their participation in a gathering where cultural values of their community are shared and are reinforced, we felt that the task could also help develop the learner's spirit. The Pow Wow is just one example of the tasks that were created for the Nishnaabemowin revitalization context. And so here are two more examples. And the first of these was created by our colleague, Alan Corbier, who was the coordinator of the ARP program at Lakeview at the time, and who'll be participating in this afternoon's panel discussion. So to create this fall feast task, we worked with existing classroom lesson plans that were created by the ARP team, and then reconceptualized the lesson as a task. And in this scenario that resulted, we see that the learning centers around the community's annual fall feast to feed the spirits. And in this task, children prepare and send invitations to their family members, so connecting to their communities, and learn about the importance and preparation of different food items at the feast in order to guide their parents and family members through the feast. Our colleague Marianne pointed out at several of our meetings that it's also very important that the tasks we design for this particular context move beyond more traditional or folkloric representations of culture, instead kind of highlighting students' dynamic identities. And so this was the impetus behind her design of this second example called the Little NHL. And this centers around the Little Native Hockey League, which is an annual high-stakes hockey competition which take place over March break every year. And so in this task, students were asked to tweet highlights of the game and use vocabulary and language for sports that they've learned to then recap the different highlights and to vote on which tournament player deserves the title of MVP. We'll have a chance later today to hear about other tasks that were created for other linguistic and cultural contexts. But for now, Enrica will conclude our part of the presentation with a discussion of the findings from our work in these two particular contexts.
We have a little bit of delay because we started a bit later, so I'll try to summarize quickly to give you a moment for some questions. We will take a question during the day, as you can imagine. So the data I'm just discussing quickly with you now are just referring to this experimentation in that context, as I said, and we will have more data later in the second presentation. But what was interesting for us, what emerged was this idea of student engagement, that the idea that the learning of the language was connected to real life. And it's interesting that the students said, yeah, before we might have felt a little bit shy to go to a powwow, but because we've explored it in this way, now we can go in, like we know what to look for. And maybe we can be a little bit of a part of a group that knows what is happening, kind of thing. So this, although they didn't go physically to a powwow, but the very fact that it was they worked in a realistic way and strictly connected to the reality made this the content of the learning become alive, basically. Here, it's another important quote for showing how this real-life oriented classroom activities spoke to the students. They said, well, we never really got to do that, no? I didn't know, I didn't really send a letter, so I sent a letter to my grandma like that, because that was one of the subtasks, to write this letter. And the question was, what sort of things were you doing before? Well, just writing, you know? So this idea of writing, disconnected from an audience, from a clear scope for writing, was somehow visible in the student. The student realized that this would be their point. In terms of plurilingualism, also, it was interesting because they say, because of LITE, which is the portfolio, it was like asking us, because LITE was asking us our history and other languages we know, we actually got into conversation with people about their origins. This was very shared also beyond this context. So for the first time, people were kind of seen as having different facets and different histories and origins, and they started to emerge. And then it says, so yes, I think it may be added to the class. And then when we were in groups, when we had a chance to talk, we actually started talking about our origins because we were asked to describe it on LITE. So it's something that they wouldn't have done automatically, but because they were pushed towards that, towards this reflective attitude, that they kind of discovered all an invisible part of themselves and their other co-students, other friends. In terms of potential of action-oriented learning, this idea that it is not only real-life oriented, but culturally relevant. So here we have some idea, some data from the teachers that say those that really connected with the culture behind, they really got into it. Like they were really taken by what they were doing. They were participated and were part of the event, of the learning event. And this interest in the language and the culture was also something that the teachers witnessed and wanted to say. And finally, one teacher said, well, task-based or the action-oriented allows for more flexibility and hypothetically real-life application rather than just playing with the flashcards. So they were clearly conscious, the teachers, that even if it's hypothetical, I mean, not every time you can do what you are planning in the scenario. Sometimes you can, sometimes it's more let's pretend, but it's so linked that they could see the real life orientation. And of course there were challenges. One of the challenge was in scaffolding and lesson planning towards this real life language usage. It was hard for me as a teacher to come up with something that would be realistic, but at the same time simple at their level. So this was one of the challenges. How can I do things that are realistic already, real life oriented, when I'm teaching at lower levels? Another piece of data was lesson planning is the core point. And I needed to make agenda of what I'm doing, so I went back to LINCDIRE. So there was this kind of looking for a theme and then applying it. There was this aspect that emerged, the idea that LINCDIRE was seen as a resource because it gave ideas and the themes and the kind of scaffolding, but then it was also difficult to plan to all the sub-steps in order to bring the students to be able to do what was meant in the theme. Balancing the use of English in the class, that was another aspect that emerged. We have said that plurilingualism encourages the use of different languages, but where do we put the cap? Where is the balance? What is the good percent? And one teacher says, yeah, having the balance was an issue. And one teacher says, I'm totally pro-immersion, but at the same time, I think English is a tool for the student. And she says, well, probably what I'm saying would be not so well accepted by others, because there's always this idea of if we let the other language enter, where do we stop? Where do we go? Which was a problem, sure, but it was also done by the teacher in a reflective way. The very fact that they asked themselves was already a very good first step, because they were aware that it was easy for them to revert back into English too much. So where do we put the limit? And that was a learning process for both of the students and the teachers, because neither of them was used to that. We can say that we had successes, even if we didn't pilot much in the indigenous context. We piloted more, we had much more chances to pilot more extensively in the other languages. But we can already say this, that the awareness raising process in teachers was very big. This idea that the teaching needs to be authentic and relevant to real life, so that setting real life oriented goals and working towards achieving them is an important part of the process. And also the fact that you have different proficiency levels in the class and you have to work with them. Among the students also there was this awareness raising process, because they saw language more as a living and lived tool and a real life use oriented. And also they started to flesh out this linguistic and cultural diversity, which sounds sometimes very theoretic, very out there. There are for sure areas of growth, because one of the things that emerged was that teachers don't necessarily felt pedagogically strong enough, and they didn't feel that they had enough pre-service and in-service teacher education. There was this difficulty in planning, above all planning medium and long term. There was this idea of planning day by day, yes, but planning over a period of time, and as you can imagine, those scenarios require hours, some hours to be done, was a difficulty. And then incomplete implementation of the action-oriented approach was another problem, because in a sense, you should change the mindset to embrace this new vision. So if you just cherry pick certain aspects, it's a problem, because it can jeopardize the effectiveness of the entire approach. And this was a challenge that we noticed. And I thank you for this first, and yeah, we have the same, we managed in our time, but we had a little bit of delay, but still we can take a couple of questions and before moving to the second presentation. And maybe what I can do is to see the colleagues. Yes. So, any question, any reactions? Oh, can you see us from those that are online? Can you still, okay, because there is a thing that says screen sharing is stopped. Oh, okay, fine. It's just because I closed my other PowerPoint. So you too, if you have questions or comments, please feel free, and we will, either me or Angelica will reply, or Alan or other colleagues in the room. And while I'm waiting, yeah. Yes, please.
Well, I was very fascinated by the whole project, and we appreciate it. It's very interesting, and thank you for sharing it.
Thank you.
I had a question about, you mentioned when you were talking about plurilingualism and pluriculturalism, and then you mentioned that errors are an opportunity for transfer.
Yeah.
So could you expand on that? Like, how are they?
Well, the idea is that we have always thought in the books, there are typical errors that, I don't know, Spanish speakers make when they learn English, or Italian speakers or German speakers. And so the idea was to try and kind of even prevent those errors, like deal with that in a kind of obstacle view. Okay, all Spanish speaker will make that mistake. All Italian speaker will keep forgetting that part, or the order of the adjectives, just to give you an example. Whereas in this view, it's like, okay, how do you do when you construct the sentence? Where do you put? How do you do a negative, for example, in Italian or in German? What kind of pieces you put, and how do you do that in your target language if the target language is English? So where are the similarities? Where are the differences? And by realizing that you do in a certain way, by not giving it for granted, this is a kind of, can be a starting point for saying, oh, I see, oh yes, this is why I have this kind of, I keep doing this error, but this is not because I didn't understand, it's just because, for example, I'm kind of driven to do that. And it's really a shift of perspective. And also, if you have more languages, for example, in a language, a certain structure or a certain type of vocabulary is kind of similar to the language you are learning, but it has never been considered as another resource. For example, you're learning a Neo-Latin language, you have already another one. Very often you have something that you can tap into and say, oh yes, I'm learning French, and in Italian, they say that. And so why don't, oh, they are similar. See, usually these have been kept separate and not used as a way of discussing errors as a step in the process. Why I'm doing that? Why am I having this difficulty? Let's get into it and try to understand. And sometimes people say, yes, but what if the languages are very far away from each other? Well, they still have a structure, a way, a syntax, etc. So very often, some people, for example, have difficulties in expressing the past because in their language, it's not expressed through verbs, for example. But this you need to be aware and to see as an important point. I hope I explained. Any other comments or question? Otherwise, you can still have time later. Don't worry. We can move to the second, maybe. Any comments or question from the people who are remote and are attending remotely? No? Okay. Then I'll invite Jason and Kimberly to come and go into the second presentation.